Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we discuss the hard questions of history, culture, religion, and policy that affect the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. I'm honored to have with me today Gia Chacón, the founder of For the Martyrs and the woman behind the March for the Martyrs. Gia, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's great to have you. I know we've been kind of in touch for a couple months now, trying to set up this podcast shoot. Obviously with you in California, us here in DC, it wasn't so easy, but it just worked out so fortunately that you're here in DC for a few things over the next few days, and here we are. So thanks for coming. Now, one thing is for sure in this space, the international religious freedom space, Christian advocacy space, Gia Chacón is synonymous with For the Martyrs, March for the Martyrs specifically, and we definitely want to talk about that in some great depth. But before that, I want to let our viewers learn a little bit about you. So if you could tell us, who is Gia Chacón?
Well, born and raised in California, I'm a Cali girl through and through. Maybe I don't look like your typical California girl, but I love where I'm from. So I'm a little cold here in DC today. But yeah, I come from a family, I was telling you, on my mother's side, we're Lebanese and Italian. On my father's side, we're Mexican. So it's kind of an interesting mix. But I've always had a heart for the Middle East, which came from my grandmother, who runs a nonprofit organization that focuses on international crisis relief. I went on my first trip with my grandmother when I was 12 years old to Egypt. And even from that young age, being in the Middle East, I remember being impacted by the faith of Egyptian Christians. And I didn't obviously, of course, have the full understanding of why the faith of Coptic Christians was so powerful, or why that resonated with me at such a young age. But through the years, heard stories from my grandmother and her work with the persecuted church, and then began working with her organization. And when I was 20 years old, I returned to Egypt for the first time in my adult life. And it was really during that trip, surrounded by the faith of Egyptian Christians, and realizing that it wasn't just the older generations, but it was young people my age and even younger who were suffering for their faith and who were so on fire. And so on that trip, I made a decision, that I never wanted to live another day not fully in the service of Christ, because I was so deeply touched by their faith. I've said these Christians, they're willing to lay their life on the line every day to go to church, to serve Jesus, just to be a Christian. And that resonated with me so deeply. But also, it began my heart for the persecuted church. And that's really where everything started.
That's an amazing story. So it sounds as though you were raised in the faith, you were born into the faith, but something happened, specifically that trip to Egypt, it sounds like, that sort of gave you a different perspective of the faith, of people on trial for their faith, who are not able to live their faith. But if you could just give us a timeline. So you went on this trip, you worked with your grandmother's nonprofit, and kind of got your feet wet with this type of work. When was it that For the Martyrs came to fruition, or it just became an idea, if not come to fruition?
Yeah, so after that trip, traveling with my grandmother, so I was 20 years old, I began working with her, helping coordinate her overseas mission. So not all of the work we were doing was in the Middle East with the persecuted church, but we went a few times to Egypt, many times to Egypt, working with the Coptic Christians. And then we also, in 2018, went on 2 trips to do work with the Iraqi and Syrian refugees, Christians who suffered directly under ISIS, who were living in Jordan. And it was really on that trip that I made the decision, we have to do more. I have to do more for the persecuted. And so I started, first of all, I couldn't believe that there was so much suffering. I couldn't really even wrap my head around the suffering of Christians under ISIS. It was like, especially coming from America, where we have such beautiful freedoms, we can practice our faith so freely. It was difficult for me to understand the suffering. But I couldn't believe how much joy these Christians had despite their suffering. And so I thought, American Christians need to hear these stories. And I started doing more research into persecution. And I came to the realization that not only are Christians being persecuted at a rate like never before, there's more Christians who are dying for the faith now than any other time in church history, which is shocking, that Christian persecution is increasing every single year, but that this is not just happening in the Middle East. This is happening in China, in North Korea, around the world. Christians are suffering for their faith. So if these things are true, if Christians are the most persecuted religious group, if Christian persecution is increasing every year, this is a global issue. Why is the American church not talking about this? Why is this not on the forefront of priorities for every pastor and priest? And so really, it was after that trip that I decided I wanted to do something specific for the persecuted church. And in 2019, so the following year, I officially founded For the Martyrs.
That's amazing. And you're absolutely right. The silence was deafening during and in the wake of the ISIS genocide of Christians in the Middle East. What I find so interesting, and of course your background definitely informs the reason why you took up a mission such as this, but what sets you apart? What is it about your upbringing or the values you were raised with, if you're able to identify really, that sets you apart from the typical American raised young person that kind of put this mission at the forefront of your heart?
I think it really is my grandmother's influence, and just seeing her my whole life make an impact, not just with the persecuted church, but with people. Like, she was always someone who responded to crisis, and she was influenced heavily by the life of Mother Teresa. She actually had an opportunity to meet with her, and she was many times, and she was a co-worker of the Missionaries of Charity. And I think one of the things that maybe she adopted from Mother Teresa is, even if the crisis is huge and it seems like, that just one person or just one organization, we can't fight this alone, it's still worth it to respond, to do what you can, to do whatever's in your power to help people. And even if you can help one person or change one heart, it's worth it to do that work. So I think definitely my grandmother's legacy, but also my mother's encouragement that if you have a heart for something, if you feel strongly about something, then you should pursue that. That's
amazing. God bless your grandmother and her work. Obviously, her work in the nonprofit sphere had tremendous impact from what it sounds like to you, or from you. But one thing that she may not have foreseen when she set out the gate is the fact that her granddaughter would take on the torch, and that probably was more gratifying than many other things she encountered in life. So that's really wonderful. One thing that sounds to me like sets you apart, in addition to your life story and the influence of your grandmother and mother in your life, is the fact that, unfortunately, I say this with great regret, unlike many youth in today's society, particularly in the United States and in the West, it sounds as though you have this very acute sense of meaning. So it's more than just paying the bills, monetary gain, which drives and motivates many folks in today's society, and understandably so. That's important stuff. Meaning also informs every decision you make, it sounds to me like. What are some ways that we can bring that back? I mean, your march has done a huge service in bringing this back into the forefront of the consciousness of young people. But what are some things as a society, as young people, as adults, in the workplace or in the nonprofit space can do to bring meaning back to the consciousness of American youth?
That's a great question. I think you're right in the sense that I have, or even before, I was in touch with that there is a greater purpose, that my life has a greater purpose. And I really owe that to my mother again, because she told us from a young age, like, God has something great for your life. You have a calling, you have a mission, and it's up to you to respond to that. But I think so many young people were, even in the Christian space, were influenced so heavily by culture, and were influenced in this society that's all about the self, about serving yourself. And frankly, it's impossible to find meaning if you're only looking at, what am I going to get out of this? How can I be successful for myself or do something only for me? And when you realize that your purpose in this life is actually to impact other people, whether that's just in the workplace, whether that's through your job, you can do it through a nonprofit organization. Not everybody needs to go and be a missionary overseas to find purpose or to make an impact. But when you start taking on the outlook that your life is actually for the service of other people, even in the smallest ways, I think that young people will find purpose and they'll find meaning in everything they do.
I think your focus on and your use of the word martyrdom, this concept, is so key to draw that contrast, because I think you absolutely correctly said today's society is more self-oriented and self-focused,
Right.
where this idea of victimhood is directed inwardly,
Right. Yeah.
Dovetailing nicely with this idea of the self. But this concept of martyrdom kind of takes that victim status, if you will, and puts it on someone or some people, many people who are deserving of that title, who actually are victims, who actually are bearing witness for their faith at their own peril. So I think it's critical, one, to bring attention to the cause of martyrs, historical and current, but also to draw that stark contrast, that's sort of a cultural commentary that's so relevant today.
Yeah, and this idea of martyrdom, a lot of people, they don't realize, well, I guess now, the word martyr, we understand it in today's context of meaning to die for your faith, but that wasn't always the original meaning. So actually, if we look at scripture and we hear the story of Stephen, who was the first martyr, and we look at the original Greek translation, it actually says Stephen the witness. So the word martyr in its original translation meant witness because you were bearing witness to the truth of Christ, and ultimately you would die for that. So that's how it changed to adopt the meaning that you would be put to death for your faith, which is what we have now. But something, I don't know if you know who Jason Jones is, who runs the Vulnerable People Project.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, he's amazing, total powerhouse. But he has a quote that I absolutely love, going back to what you said about victimhood, right? And he always says that vulnerable people are not weak people. They're incredibly strong people in impossible situations. And I think that really actually applies the mentality of the persecuted, because this idea of victimhood that we have in the United States is, I feel so sorry for myself, right? Like, I'm a victim, this is happening to me. But actually, when we look at the persecuted, they're strong people. They're willing to die for Christ. They're happy in the sense that they know that their suffering brings meaning. And so their idea of victimhood and martyrdom is completely different than ours.
That's absolutely amazing. Yeah, I totally agree with that. One point I just want to bring forward, actually, the point you brought forward that I want to comment on, how this concept of martyrdom actually means witness, to bear witness. The Syriac word, and I hope that I always have to bring Syriac into this.
Yes,
Everybody
please
knows
do.
This. Yeah. So the word for martyr in Syriac is sohdo, which actually comes from the root word and is the same word as the witness.
Yeah.
So when you bear witness to something, you're a sohdo. When you are suffering for your faith, you're a sohdo. So yeah, very very interesting correlation there. And I often say the way to really access the original meaning and not so much meaning, but the nuance of Christianity can be done with a Semitic Eastern lens, and it kind of adds something a little bit special, I would say, to that. Shifting just a little bit on the same topic, though, where would you probably identify the greatest areas of concern today? We talked a bit about the church suffering for certainly centuries in the Middle East, but now China and in the Far East tends to be a hotspot for Christian persecution. How would you take that conversation?
Well, I mean, I think everybody in our space is paying attention to what's happening in Nigeria, and I know In Defense of Christians has done a lot of work for Nigerian Christians and advocating for them. We see actually the most violent persecution of Christians is happening in Nigeria, and I think if my numbers are correct, I think it was over 5,000 Christians were slaughtered in Nigeria in 2022 alone, which is shocking and devastating. And what's so interesting also about Nigeria is that even though Christians are suffering at the hands of Islamic extremism, Christians are actually a majority in the country. I believe it's pretty close, but it's a Christian majority country, and still Christians are being persecuted there. So we're paying attention to what's happening in Nigeria. We're absolutely paying attention to what's happening in China, because we see a different kind of persecution. It's going digital in China. And so the government is actually giving people a social credit score where every time you go to church, every time you attend a Bible study, you get your social credit score gets dinged.
Wow.
Yes, and they're using facial recognition to target Christians, and they're using cameras and technology to monitor what's being said and preached inside of churches. And so we see this much more sinister oppression of Christians in China. Of course, North Korea is the most dangerous place to be a Christian. It's illegal to say, I believe in Jesus or I believe in God, and you can be killed even for having a scripture written on a piece of paper or for saying those words, you and your family could be killed. So those are just a few places that we're paying attention to.
Yeah, to your point on Nigeria, it's a huge area of concern. It's a place, as you said, In Defense of Christians has been focused on, of course, we started as a group focused on Middle East Christians, but Nigeria is such a disaster and a catastrophe that's developing every day. We can't not focus our attention on that. We're happy to report, in fact, just this last week, we worked with the office of Congressman Chris Smith, who introduced a congressional resolution to bring attention and action, of course, to the issue facing Christians in Nigeria, one of which is to restore the country of particular concern status by the State Department, and also to require the State Department to send a special envoy who will monitor on the ground, and for the State Department to provide an annual report to Congress on the situation on the ground in Nigeria. So we're hoping that it gains traction. I think it will. This is an area that nobody's yet to really put on their radar at this point. But it's a matter of bringing results forward. Now, you spoke a little bit about the genesis of the March for the Martyrs, and I think it's a wonderful story. What would you say is the mission, the objective of the March as it stands now? We're in year number 3. We're heading into year number 4, which is amazing. And it's gained so much traction. It's taken on a life of its own.
Thank you.
But if you could share with us a bit about the mission, what you hope to achieve through the March.
Sure. So for the Martyrs as an organization, I founded it to raise awareness about the crisis of Christian persecution, advocate for religious freedom, and provide aid to suffering Christians around the world. But really, the idea of March for the Martyrs came before For the Martyrs as an organization.
I see.
Because I always participate in the March for Life every year. And actually, during this time, if you remember, we were seeing really the beginning of other social justice movements in the United States start to rally, hold marches, amongst other things. And I thought it would be so powerful if we could have a movement for the persecuted church. This issue of persecution is typically something that the older generation is paying attention to. The people that were involved in Voice of the Martyrs and Open Doors USA, those kind of like iconic Christian persecution nonprofit organizations. So I really was asking God and myself, how can we make this issue something relevant to young people and give them a tangible way to make an impact in the lives of the persecuted? And so while those other marches were happening, I thought, how cool would it be if we could do a walk or a procession for the persecuted church? And I was like, this was a conversation I was actually having with my mom. And she said, well, what would you call it? And I swear in that moment, I thought, what about March for the Martyrs?
There you go.
And it was born. But kind of how we came to that conclusion and why I thought the March would be such a powerful response to the plight of the persecuted is, and I'm sure you know this, Rich, when you talk to somebody who has suffered for their faith, when you talk to a Christian who has been persecuted in the Middle East, and you ask them, what is the greatest need? They will almost always say, first, before anything else, please continue to pray for us. And the second thing they'll say is, thank you for standing with us. Thank you for knowing and caring about our suffering. So if the number one concern from the mouth of the persecuted is pray for us and stand with us, we can do that through March for the Martyrs. And we can create a coalition of Christians across denominations to come together as one voice for our brothers and sisters and say, we're praying for you and we're standing with you from the United States.
Yeah, well, it certainly has gained traction over these last 3 years. It's more than, like I said, it's more than an event, it's more than an organization, it's really a movement. And it's really become popular with young people across denominations. Oftentimes, the challenge that organizations witness is that it'll be pigeonholed as a Catholic organization or Catholic movement or a Protestant or Orthodox. But it's been so universal in my observation, the times that I've been and taken part. The popularity has been really, I think, the motivating factor among the young people, the people who are make it not your grandfather's movement, as they say. So, got to ask, what's the secret sauce to making it a movement of that sort?
I think it's a couple things. So first, you can't be afraid to be a little controversial. And I know that March for the Martyrs, we get a little edgy at times. So I think there's that. But also, I really think that young people are hungry for a purpose. They're hungry for a cause. They want to champion something, which is why marches like the March for Life, or even the other marches that have happened in the United States, even the Women's March. Why do we see such a huge turnout from young people? They want to be a champion of a cause. They want to feel like their voice is being heard. And at March for the Martyrs, your voice for the persecuted is being heard, and we need everyone's voice, especially young people. And I think especially when you don't have a lot of resources, maybe you feel like you don't have a lot of influence, you know that you're making an impact by using your voice and standing with the persecuted at March for the Martyrs.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you've tapped into that demographic, because despite my previous commentary on young people in the United States today, I don't want to sound like, get off my lawn or anything, but there is such incredible let's say redeeming value within the young generation today, because they are hungry for meaning, they are hungry to help, they are hungry for a cause bigger than themselves, that's no doubt. But it's a matter of giving them and delivering to them something that they can get on board with, right. That is, in the right place, in the right direction, because as you said, there are other competing, not even competing, but there are other alternative social justice causes out there that people could very easily get onto just because they think, hey, I want to make a difference, which is a laudable sentiment, but you just got to give them and deliver them one that's oriented and directed in the right place for the right reasons, with an honorable outcome, let's say. And I think that's sort of like maybe an unintended effect of the March for the Martyrs and the mission of For the Martyrs is the fact that we are giving young people, yes, we are drawing attention to the cause itself. We are giving young people today something to rally behind. Just a couple weeks ago there was the March for Life. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the privilege of going. I wish I had. I say that to myself every year, but next year I certainly will. But that's an example. Yeah. And I think the March for the Martyrs is very much sort of in line with that. And I truly believe, I'm not just saying this because you're sitting right in front of me, but I truly believe that one day the March for the Martyrs can be at the level in terms of population and growth and profile as the March for Life. Is that something that's on your radar, or?
We hope so, God willing, and we would really, more than just, having those numbers, it's that people would care enough about this issue that they would come and, that it would continue to spread, and that the plight of the persecuted, the awareness around this issue would continue to grow. And so if we are able to achieve March for Life, growth one day, that would be, just a blessing that many people are coming to pray for the persecuted in Washington, D.C. But I think you hit on something important too regarding what young people get out of coming to the March for the Martyrs. And it really isn't just young people, this is really for everyone. I think it's impossible not to be impacted by the stories of the persecuted and the faith of the persecuted. So as you're coming to March for the Martyrs or getting involved in the plight of persecuted Christians, you're also being impacted and changed and empowered. It's impossible not to feel inspired when you hear the story of a pastor in China who continued to preach the gospel despite the fact that he knew he was going to be imprisoned, or a young Iraqi Christian who suffered under ISIS but never lost their hope. How can we as American Christians hear these stories and not be impacted by them, right? So I think that March for the Martyrs, as we're standing with the persecuted, we're also becoming emboldened and empowered in our own faith here. Absolutely.
No, and I thought what was particularly impactful for me anyway was at this past March at the Museum of the Bible after the March concluded, was the fact that on stage you had people speaking there who were survivors themselves from China, from the Middle East. So it's not just people speaking who actually went through it and bore witness themselves, but also you were able to give air, let's say, to the persecuted church from China, the persecuted church from the Middle East, and so on. So I thought that was incredible, because it brings it to an audience who they may be, let's say, on fire or really desirous of helping how they can, but they've never really had that direct access unless they maybe read it in a book or somewhere. But these young, let's say, 18 to 25-year-olds in the United States, hearing from a Chinese pastor or a survivor from Iraq is a huge impact. So no, it's wonderful what you do. It's wonderful what you continue to do. And last year was my first year attending the march. I know the first year was in California, then the last two were here in D.C. I'm not sure why I wasn't at the first one in D.C., but I was at the second one, and I really enjoyed it. It was a blessing to join. It was at the Museum of the Bible, which you couldn't have found a better venue than that. So yeah, I really appreciated the time.
Thank you. Yeah, as I've said, first of all, before I even founded For the Martyrs, I knew of the work of In Defense of Christians, and I always have just appreciated the work that you're doing and making such an impact to such an effective organization, which is, sad to say, almost rare in our space. So yeah, and it was wonderful to hear from you last year as well.
Great, yeah, absolutely. I actually had the pleasure of taking part in one of the panels, and you moderated the panel. It was myself and Andrew, who is also, he's the president here at IDC. So yeah, it was a pleasure. We met, also on the panel was Father Simon Ishaki.
Yes.
He was on the panel, and
he's TikTok famous. Some people might know.
Is he really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you're listening and you know Father Simon, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize he's TikTok famous. Yeah, that's great. We had a chance just to meet very briefly, but we obviously we exchanged info, and we've been in contact since then. So yeah, great guy to know, and great lineup you had, and we really enjoyed it. We're looking forward to next year. Anything on the radar for next year just yet, or is it still early?
It's still early, but I mean, you can never start these things early enough. The goal is to just always, continue to grow, to continue to involve Christians of all denominations in this space. I think that the March for the Martyrs is a unifying event, kind of what you touched on earlier. I think it's easy to want to, especially being Catholic myself, it's easy to want to say, okay, this is just for one denomination. But really, when you're persecuted, they don't ask you what denomination you are. Right. When you're suffering, in the Middle East, when you're suffering for your faith and you're a Christian, it's because of the cross, it's because of Christ, not because you're Catholic or Syriac or Orthodox. So our goal, and part of the heart of March for the Martyrs is to bring all denominations as one voice, and this is an opportunity for Christians in the United States to come together as one voice. So it's always the last Saturday of September. So if you're listening and you want to be involved in the March for the Martyrs in Washington, D.C., it's going to be the last Saturday of September, and we'll have, speakers and, survivors of persecution as always as well.
That's excellent. Well, in Defense of Christians, we always look forward to participating in the march as we have, and whatever else we can do to make the march richer, we're happy to do. One thing I have, and I might as well do it in front of the cameras, is we'd love to do a Hill Day with you guys. If you're here doing the march, maybe we can do a Hill Day.
That would be amazing.
This is the first time she's hearing this, so you're in on that very first conversation. So, I think, a 2-day event wouldn't be a bad thing for sure. I mean, we can do like a Hill Day.
That would be awesome.
Whoever's in town for the march, get them on the Hill. They can talk to their member from their district on the issues that, that are important to us.
And I think young people would love to be involved in that as well. I think that would be awesome. Let's do it.
Excellent.
You heard it here first.
Awesome. Well, it was great to talk to you. Thanks for stopping by. It's always a pleasure to have you in D.C. when you are here. And we'll look forward to seeing you last Saturday in September. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rich.